Okay, so quickly, talking about barriers and facilitators of returns to housing, and then we'll launch into sort of where we go from here. So 82% of folks, Black folks, right, named that they just couldn't afford housing, right? And so, again, I think we just need to be super clear that the underlying drivers of homelessness for everybody is that our housing market is a runaway train and it's jumped the tracks, right? That is true nationally. It's why housing showed up in everybody's presidential platform all of a sudden, is because like no one can afford housing the way that we could 60, 70 years ago. Um, and so when we talk about how do we get folks into housing, we need to be addressing affordability with either individual factors like vouchers or cash supports, sort of more market side controls, like the development of affordable housing or sort of rent stabilization, et cetera, right? But like we have to do, it has to be one of the two, because we need to be able to make sure that folks are able to pay the rent. Um, Lengthy wait lists and delayed exits, right? So 59% of Black folks noted that the long wait lists were a barrier, compared to 48% and 49%. There may be some interaction here actually between the age data and the race data, in that because Black folks sort of skewed a little bit older, one of the things that we saw for older adults, generally speaking, is more likely to be demoralized by a long wait list, right? Which I think makes sense if you think about just sort of where someone is psychologically with regard to time, right? Um, Folks, again, a participant said, I got money to put away to move in somewhere, but it's got to be affordable. And we went there and they said it takes anywhere from 1 year to 2 years, right? So this is a participant who had money, looking for an affordable place, and then
What's the word?
found out,
You didn't answer. Shit. That's my message.
sorry, I'm getting sound from somewhere. Is someone trying to ask something? No? Okay. Um, the uh getting sort of psychologically, right? Pushed back, I guess, by the length of time. Um, and then 51% of folks reported discrimination when trying to rent, which is very in line with the data, as compared to 31% of white Californians who reported this, right? But that's true regardless of the experience of homelessness, right? Like Black folks have a lot of difficulty securing apartments to rent, mortgages, like all that stuff, significant levels of racial discrimination still. This participant said, if I'm going to go into what I consider to be a decent neighborhood, sometimes the person will come out to show you the place and they've already got me figured out. They've got me pegged. I'm Black. They say, what type of work do you do? Well, I was homeless. I'm heavily scrutinized like that. Somehow or another, it's like we got homeless on our foreheads or something, invisible. So, um, I think the experience of trying to situate yourself in, what you would consider to be a neighborhood that you want to live in, right? Has that double discrimination, right, of both the racial discrimination and the discrimination that folks experiencing homelessness all report. And then finally, right, we asked folks sort of what would help them return to housing, right? 97% said a housing voucher, something similar to a housing choice voucher would, right? 96% thought housing navigation. This is also in line with data that we see from the unsheltered report, which we just put out, which shows that only about 22% of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness reported having talking with a housing navigation specialist or a case manager at least once per month in the last 6 months, right? So like a lot of people just feel like they're not getting any support and getting, back into housing. 85% thought a shallow monthly subsidy, and 96% thought a lump sum payment of 5 to 10K, right? Like that would help stabilize their financial and economic position. Okay, so that's all of the data. Let's pause super fast and see if there are any questions or comments. I've got a fair amount I still want to get through by the end of our time today. So super quick pause because I do want to make sure that we have time for discussion when I get through everything. Anything?
Anyone? Okay, we're kind of quiet on the room, so.
All right. I'm not seeing.
Oh, wait, got one, got
Oh,
one.
okay.
Marisol Rodriguez, H&H, as a youth services coordinator. I just wanted to uplift the piece around the discrimination with rental discrimination, and also highlight the intersection that our youth actually uplifted last week, which is discrimination of young people as well. And our Black youth specifically, naming how challenging it is and embarrassing it is for them to show up to like rental openings with, our Bay Area culture, lots of tech folks and different folks, and feeling like they're just so demoralized in those moments, knowing that their age and their race will be a huge barrier to even be considered for a union. Thank you.
I appreciate that. Additional context. I think that's important for folks.
Mark, thank you. One thing I wanted, you were mentioning some of the barriers, and one thing that's crossed my mind, I wonder if you considered is, sometimes I come across these amazing resources that had I known about it, for housing, I would have applied. Like for instance, hey, you can be a first-time homeowner, or you can get help with your rent or whatever, or Section 8 vouchers are open. And like, I don't find out about it till after, and that is demoralizing. And so I think that is a barrier in terms of marketing and PR that is extremely important, that maybe we can find ways to do something about. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think, from my perspective, I would say some of that is about that like housing navigation support, right? Like a good housing navigator is saying those things to you, right? Like, hey, let's like Section 8 is opened, or hey, like here's this program that you qualify for to help pay a mortgage, right? Um, that I think is something that I think we need to be hearing when we hear that people don't have that housing navigation support. Um, I want to push
I think,
forward.
um,
Oh, sorry.
I'm catching up. I think additionally, since you
I'm,
know many persons with disability may have underlying literacy or content, having accessible
I think someone is
material.
speaking who's on also on video. I'm not sure if you mean to be unmuted.
Oh, I just share a comment relating to housing
I'm sorry.
navigation.
You had a comment related to housing navigation? Yeah, go ahead. I'm
Yes,
sorry.
having accessible equipment to facilitate persons who may be blind, have literacy issues, be able to make avail of those programs is also very key to being told about an opportunity. Thank you.
I appreciate that. The sound was a little in and out, but what I think I heard was that it's really important to have uh, materials, right, that are accessible to a wide range of folks, and I
Yes.
very much agree. Um, All right, let's keep going. Um, the the question I think that I ask um, is and get asked, right, is like, okay, so like all this is true. Like, then what do we do with it, right? Um, and I think that's been difficult. I'm just going to be honest, right? I think that's been difficult for a lot of COC continuums of care across the country. And I've been doing a lot of thinking lately about sort of what are the next places to go. If you'll grant me some grace, some of this is newer thinking that I still need to write up and publish. But I wanted to share some of it with you today, given the conversations that you all are having. So first, I just want to say that like all of this, right, has a historic context, right? The overrepresentation of Black communities and homeless population arises from 400 years of anti-Black racism that is entrenched in our structures, institutions, ideologies, and social norms, right, for this country. And it starts with slavery and frankly, to some degree, before slavery. Um, and the historic context there, right, is that we want to understand that slavery itself is a state of homelessness, right? It is a dispossession and an inability to have property. Jim Crow laws, right? Like then post-slavery really made it impossible for the vast majority. I mean, like we're talking like 99.9% of Black people to engage in the wealth building mechanisms of this country. Redlining in the 30s, 40s, 50s, early 60s, right? Well, really, redlining didn't really go away until the 70s, if we're being honest, with implementation of the civil rights era legislation, which is not fully implemented. And we should just, always sort of have that in the back of our minds as well. Never got fully implemented. Um, and then this then drives racial wealth and home ownership gaps, right? And that there's this connection that we talked about earlier between education, carceral, and employment systems with homelessness, right? Um, and all of this is the context, right, that we need to be navigating when we talk about, okay, so what is the responsibility of a homelessness system in directly addressing racial justice? And it feels really big, right? I mean, it is big. It feels impossible for a crisis response system that is underfunded, that is strapped, that is frankly composed of majority folks of color to do this kind of work. So I want to name that and lift that up because I think that is true that it is big, but we also have a responsibility to innovate in response to how big that is and figure out where we're going to go.
Yeah.
A lot of this leads to impossible choices, right? So a cast participant shared a story of giving her aunt custody of her children due to an intimate partner violence situation and the threat of a CPS intervention. Again, that's that hyper policing, hyper surveilling. And going back to what I was saying before, Black Californians are more likely to experience multiple episodes of homelessness. So 72% of single adults and 78% of transition age youth were likely to report recurrent episodes. And that's more than Black adults and families, right? But it's just more important to me that like we focus on that 71% of Black Californians are experiencing recurrent episodes. And this, I think, again, tells us something about the nature of homelessness in the Black community, right? That it has this recurrence, this episodic nature to it that is structurally different than what we see in other communities. Um, and right, that there's often high levels of economic precarity before homelessness, right? So prior to homelessness, median income was $1,200 for leaseholders, right? And $960 for non-leaseholders. Um, and people seek help in the community before they seek help from the government, right? So only 11% of Black Californians sought help from a government agency, but nearly 30%, 29%, but nearly 30 primarily sought help from friends and family, but that help was often insufficient. And then finally, the last thing that I think is really important as we sort of chart, okay, so how do we sort of take all this information and all this history and turn it into something is that there's this network strain, right? Like, so a large proportion, nearly half of Black Californians didn't make any rent contribution while doubled up. That's really interesting to me, actually, right? And I mean, like, frankly, that was me. Like, again, for just being honest, right? Like, I was not paying rent while I was couch surfing. Um, and it goes back to that thing that I was saying about like sort of we've all had someone, sort of eat up all the cereal, right? And when that happens, when someone eats up all the cereal and you need to buy more cereal, that actually is an unexpected expense, right? That's something that creates strain on a household budget. And all of this got me sort of thinking about the way in which Black community, I mean all people, but Black communities in particular, are these like profoundly networked structures, right? And particularly with regard to our economics and the way that we use capital. And we use capital to some degree in a different way because of the way in which race has shaped our economic conditions. And forgive me for waxing philosophic, but there was this quote from this philosopher Deleuze who, again, this came to mind. We are no longer ourselves. Each will know his own. We have been aided, inspired, multiplied, right? Um, the sort of way that Black networks and Black community works is that aided, inspired, multiplied, right? Like we're always, sort of in low level, for lack of a better term, like mutual aid structures with each other, right? And if you are a Black person, I think you've probably experienced this the same way that I have. Um, and so I think what this points to is that race is not just a structure that justifies this systemic inequity, it also creates it, right? So through our networks, race is shaping the distribution of resources and power and opportunities in the United States. And a lot of that has to do with the differences in like what kinds of capital people have access to and how they deploy that capital. And we know that white communities have higher levels of access to capital through multi-generational wealth transfer, right? And I think what we also have not well structured our understanding of is that white communities deploy their capital differently than Black communities do. And when I was doing, I started all this work on racism and homelessness with something called Spark, Supporting Partnerships for Anti-Racist Communities. Um, Back a million years ago, it feels like in like 2015. And we did some of the first national research on race and homelessness. Um, and we found a phenomenon that we described as network impoverishment. And this is from our report that the team that I was within, we wrote this in 2018. But we said people are not unwilling to double up, take people in, or live in another person's home, but they do not have the capacity to accommodate the additional consumption of resources, food, household goods, etc. Right? That phenomenon is something that I think has uh, speaking as one of the researchers who developed it, like we have underexplored what that can do for us with regard to how we measure and respond to racial injustice inside the homelessness system. Um, we're running a little bit um, behind, so I'm skipping some stuff right now. But I do want to briefly, I'm going to try to play audio, and I hope that it works. So tell me if this works. This is from the Spark work that Jeff Olivat, Molly Richard, and I did, and this is an audio clip that I was doing this interview. You'll hear my voice, and it helped me understand what what I was thinking or what I came to think about. So let's see if this works.
Before that, me and my two kids and their father was living inside his mother's house.
Uh-huh.
She owns the house, but she just gave it up, so it was like a vacant house, low key.
Mm,
But
okay.
yeah,
So so she still owns it?
I have no idea if she still owns it now.
Okay.
I have no idea.
So she owned it,
Mhm.
but she just wasn't there.
Yeah, like she owned it, and then she wasn't like able to take care of it like
Uh-huh.
how she used to,
Uh-huh.
and like things started getting cut off slowly, like the water, the gas, the electricity. Started having no food, and then like she left, and then we didn't have nowhere to go, so we just stayed. And then after that, it started to get cold outside, so we just like let's just go to the shelter.
So I remember doing that interview and being baffled. It was one of the first interviews I did for Spark, and I did not understand this. It was counter to everything I had ever been trained, right? Which is like home ownership, home ownership, home ownership. And if we get to home ownership, we should be good, right? Um, and the phenomenon that this person describes is like we actually all moved into a house that somebody owned, and then we couldn't keep up with the bills, right? Like the way that the increased consumption, right, um, drove those costs was really striking to me. And what I realized is that we we talk about the pooling of social capital, but we don't talk about the pooling of social risk. And the literature on pooling risk is really underdeveloped. It kind of doesn't exist. That's why I'm writing a bunch of stuff now. Um, and so again, going unfortunately back to Deleuze, I'm sorry to do this twice to you today. It made me think about this other quote about rhizomes, right? Which is rhizomes are multiples that must be made, not always through a higher dimension, but rather in the simplest of ways, through the dint of sobriety. It's always n minus one, the only way one belongs to multiple, always subtracted, which is a little dense, but it helped me realize and conceptualize that like the thing that we needed to be thinking about was that because of race, because of the way that we have structured race and racism, um, our communities live in that sort of n minus one. We never have enough, right? Like we never have enough to spread to all the people who need it. And we use money very, very differently, right? So again, where in white communities, it's very standard to say, oh, I might pay for a niece or nephew, but we really the flow of capital is largely inside what is seen as sort of tax code identifiable household, whereas Black folks, it's not uncommon to, sort of be like, well, this month I'm paying my cousin's boyfriend's car note because I heard the laugh. I heard, so like, I, people know. Like, um, so that is a much more culturally common way of using capital for us, right? And so what that means is that even if one of us, like this big boat in this image, right? Even if one of us has a bunch of money, we're spreading it across a much wider range of people than what is typically seen as household expenditure. And so the per capita economics wind up really shallow and really rigid, right? So anything that upsets the big boat or frankly one of the little boats might destabilize that whole network. So then what does this mean for what we do, right? And like one of the things that I found really frustrating is that all of our conversation about racial justice has landed us in this place of saying, well, we need to measure proportionality, right? We need to think about how we can, get this 26% to be 7%. And I just like the more I thought about that, the more I got to this slide, which is like that feels bananas, right? Um, it doesn't make sense that we can like that we would be attempting to create like proportional suffering, right? That like and frankly, if only 7% of the California population is Black and only 7% of the population experiencing homelessness is Black, all we've done is manage the optics of which bodies experience this suffering, right? We haven't addressed why so many Black folks are experiencing homelessness, really, right? Nor have we addressed some of the underlying structures that are driving those experiences of homelessness, either for Black folks or writ large, right? So I take from this three things. One, that racist systems in the United States have created a material competitive advantage for white people, and you can see that in the homelessness crisis. And that the same racist systems have created a material competitive disadvantage for Black folks, and you can see that in the homelessness crisis and everything else, right? Um, and that the nature of those disadvantages is culturally constructed, meaning that it is advantageous to behave in a culturally white way and disadvantageous to behave in a culturally Black way. And so that then might shift what we measure, right? And how we think about what we're doing. So what I'm proposing is that we need to think about our racial equity metrics in sort of three dimensions, right? And if you ever took calculus, which I had to take and it was not fun. We'd done everything on X and Y axis, and it was always Y equals MX plus B. And then suddenly in calc, they were like, oh, there's a Z axis, and it ruined my life. It was the worst thing. Um, so I was really disappointed when my thinking went there for this. Um, but right, like if we start thinking about sort of measuring in three dimensions, what we sort of get to is that we could think about our traditional areas, right? The sort of like individual stuff. That's the maybe that's the y-axis, the stuff we already measure, right? Like, did we get you to stable housing? Did we connect you with the thing, right? And maybe we want to add an x-axis, which might be measuring your experience of our system. I think that we don't do enough to address the sort of qualitative data, right? Like, for Black folks who don't seek, or rather only seek government assistance at 11%, right? That's really, really, really shocking. And the reason is that we don't really trust the government. And when we go, we don't really have a good experience, right? So measuring how people experience what we're doing also really matters. But then maybe our z-axis, right, our like horrible new thing, is measuring how well we address the racialized vulnerability that drove you to experience homelessness in the first place. And for Black people, what that might be is instead of just reducing overrepresentation, we focus on shifting how those systems drive Black folks into homelessness. And so we might look at again, in the specific instance, measuring how well we addressed the network's ability to maintain a stable economic footing, right? And again, if I'm sort of extrapolating that, what I get to are some action areas, right? Some places where we can do real stuff. Um, I think it's sort of addressing economic marginalization, increasing our access to affordable housing, strengthening our homelessness prevention efforts, addressing that criminal justice system stuff, ensuring equity is centered in the response system, and supporting equitable health outcomes. And I'm going to drill down in just a couple where I think we have real opportunity. So that economic marginalization, right? I think oftentimes when we talk about race, we talk about it in this interpersonal way, right? Like, how do I feel? How do I feel? How do I feel? That's that maybe X dimension. And a lot of that is important, but I think we forget that race is an economic position first and foremost, right? It was created to disenfranchise and limit, right, who could access capital. And that's what then creates, right, those advantages for other folks who then have that access to that capital. And so, if we're going to really lean into a racially just system, then we need to think about race as an economic disadvantage, first and foremost. And that means that we might prioritize things like cash intervention as how we stabilize those networks. So, what if instead of asking a whole bunch of very invasive questions as part of our intake, one of the things that we might drop it down to just a couple things, all sort of housing and network focused. And one of those questions might be, how many people give you money, and how many people do you give money to? And so if I'm a case manager, right, if I'm back to doing direct service work, that gives me an immediate understanding of the size of this person's network, right? And it also helps me understand how many people we might be trying to ensure stability for, so that if I successfully exit this person from homelessness, they're not going back into that same unstable network, which is then going to have them come back to homelessness, right? My thinking has become that those high rates of return are because when we get people out, we're actually sending them back into those same really, really destabilized economic networks because of structural racism. And we have more responsibility in terms of stabilizing that network. And that might look like cash intervention across the network. That might look like providing that person with enough money to, if they're going to be doubled up, right? Maybe they're going to be able to contribute to the household rent. It might look like making sure that the whole network is connected to available benefits. It might look like making sure that the whole network is connected to, home ownership. There are lots of different ways to think about stabilizing the network. But ultimately, right, those are all essentially forms of cash intervention. Looking at policy, right, we might think about lease structures. So more Black folks tend to be renters because, again, of the way that we have been excluded from the housing market until very recently in American history. And right, I'm speaking as a renter. If my cousin today was like, I need help, right? Can I come stay with you? Of course, I would say yes, right? But that is a violation of my lease terms, right? And if my landlord found out, I could be at risk of eviction. And that would then put me, and we talked about this, like that economic, then leading into the social, right? So then I might have to say to my cousin, hey, you can't stay here for longer than X amount of time. Or, hey, my landlord found out and you really got to go in the next like 48 hours, or like I'm going to get evicted, right? um, we might take up as a matter of policy at the sort of city, county, potentially state level, making those kinds of lease clauses illegal. Because if I'm paying rent, if this is my house for as long as I'm paying rent on it, who I allow to be in it is actually at my discretion, right? And we would never say to a homeowner, you can't have your cousin, right? So like thinking about like what actually are we saying when we say that renters are not capable of making the same decisions about a property that they are for all intents and purposes, right? Like utilizing as their own inside a contractual agreement that makes it their space. Um, and then finally, right, like thinking about how we promote access to capital and capital growth opportunities, again, as a matter of policy. I'm talking a little fast because I got 10 minutes. Um, uh, the next action area, right, is thinking about voucher programs, rent control, increased development. I really want to, sort of lean in on those voucher programs and say here, again, as a matter of policy, voucher programs often have the same sort of bizarre structures that we see in leases, right? Where, well, you can't have someone who, you can't have your in some cases, boyfriend, right, or long-term partner live with you. But again, more common to the community that I'm part of, like again, certainly your cousin could not move in with you, right? Or your aunt or your grandma, right? Like these are things that like do not necessarily fit inside how we have structured voucher programs. but are ways that my community has sought to take care of itself for many, many, many generations. And so rethinking how those voucher programs work is actually a racial justice issue. Again, if we're going to really be serious about saying that we are going to do racial justice work beyond just measuring the proportionalities of suffering. Rent control is, I think, a really big issue here, right? Like, again, we're talking about folks who have been put in the position through being locked out of generational wealth transfer, of being more often renters than not. And so regulating the rental market from that racial justice perspective is really important. And I know that it's hard to have rent control conversations, and oftentimes those are sort of dead on arrival when we talk about legislation at the, county, city, state level. But we need to bring that conversation back, and we need to be having it explicitly because we have said to generations of people, this is your only option. So if it's the only option, but every 3 seconds there's a new bill on the floor to give a tax credit to homeowners, like, where is the corresponding relief for the folks who do not have that privilege? And then obviously increased development, right? We know that our communities have been, again, redlined, like put in certain places, ghettoized, literally, right? That's the academic term. And we need to address that. And we need to think about how that, again, becomes a wealth building opportunity for our communities. So how are we creating Black-led development opportunities, right? Rather than saying that it is a success when a white-led developer builds something nice in a Black community. We can do better than that. And then finally, right, equity in the system from a prevention standpoint, we can, again, measure network stability, right? We can directly address network stability, and we can hone our measurement on returns. Why did you come back? What happened, right? All we can see in the data is the return. We have very poor insight into what the underlying drivers are, but my guess is that they are very different across all of our race ethnicity categories. And we need to begin to hone our understanding of those returns, because I think that, like, while because of my academic expertise and my life, I know about the Black community, I am positive that what I am talking about is applicable to all communities, including white people, right? And that's what I want to close with, is just saying that the pursuit of racial justice, when we talk about it, what we need to understand is that addressing these concerns for Black people actually will make the system better for everyone. And while we, often get into this sort of like, well, what about, so-and-so, right? When we focus on those who have been the most shut out, we wind up making the system better for everyone who needs it. I know I don't need to tell you that, but I feel obligated to say it because I want to make sure that for the rest of our time, right, both with me here today with you, but then also for your time today or over the next day and a half now at this convening, that you are able to really hone in on focusing on Black people doesn't make things worse for other people. It actually makes things better for other people. So that's it. That is my presentation. We got 5 more minutes. Maybe they'll let us run a little bit over. I want to again encourage folks to download the presentation, or sorry, not the presentation, sorry, the report, and dig into it. The last half of what I just talked about isn't really in there because, again, this is new thinking. I still need to write a bunch of it. I would encourage folks to reach out to us if you have any questions. I will stop sharing my screen. And if there are any questions or comments before we run out of time, happy to take them.
Thank you, Mark. That was excellent. I hope you heard the applause again. Lots of enthusiasm here in the room. I think we can do a couple of questions before we take a break. I see that we do have a hand up on the Zoom. So we'll start there, and then as folks raise their hands in the room as well, we'll do that. So I think Michelle Stirratt.
Good morning. Thank you. That was an amazing presentation. I really want to lift up this issue of when a tenant is paying rent and has a lease on a unit. It is their unit, and they should have the right to let people stay. I have been working with my team on tenant protections in the unincorporated county for almost 4.5 years now. It's been a really long haul. And one of the constant refrains from the landlord community is that it is their right to restrict who lives in that unit, and that they should have the ability to approve or disapprove anyone that comes in, and that they want to remain in control. And I think that we've never heard that argument before in all of the probably 45 public meetings that we have held. And it would be really wonderful for resident and tenant communities to step up and say, hey, wait a minute, this is our unit. We're paying for it. We really want to hear from the local community that you have rights when you rent a space. So I just really want to lift that up, because I cannot tell you how many times the landlords have exclaimed, this is our building and we have the right to tell you who can live here or not. And so thank you.
I really appreciate that, and would really encourage folks, if you're able to go to those meetings too. It's so important.
I think we have James. Is that right, James? You're first, and then we have another comment after that in the room.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Mark, for a fantastic presentation. I'm really glad that you brought in the cash context. It costs money to survive. It costs money to survive on the street. And while most of our programs talk about replacement housing or getting people into shelter, I think the cash factor is equally important. It costs money to take the bus, to buy, to just buy something, to pay a bill, there's so many things that take money, and we don't talk about that part of it when we're talking about getting people out of homelessness. But the cash aspect needs to be built in. There needs to be a subsidy that a person gets along with trying to get the person into housing so that they can just survive. So I'm really glad to hear that you're building into that context. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have this one.
Can you hear me? Okay. I have a few points because ironically sitting here, I'm a person that my mom, she lives at APC, which is on the Alameda base. Because of ailments she has, I aged out of her lease, but I'm her in-home care provider, and she gets hours and in-home care, live-in provided for what they pay for, because we might share laundry soap or the facilities and all that stuff, is that I can live with her, but they won't allow me to live with her because of something that was mentioned here, and I'm a biological child, which makes no sense. And I lost my train of thought, but I just wanted to lift that up. And the points that you made were very relevant. Just sitting here, I'm in awe. And yeah.
Thanks. I appreciate that. It's always risky to bring in, French philosophy and social theory into homelessness, but I think it's the right thing to do.
We have Tanisha.
Hi, Mark. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for your presentation. We really appreciate it. I am a co-chair of the Racial Equity Committee, and we have started a learning community for the continuum of care. And I think it would be wonderful if we could get you to come back and continue this discussion. I think we've just scratched the surface, but it would definitely be worthwhile for us to continue this conversation and deepen it in a learning community. We have those on, I think, the second Tuesday of the month. And so we know we're going into the holidays, but would you be willing to come to our learning community in 2025 to deepen the conversation?
Of course.
Thank you. So we'll make sure that we reach out to home base to get your contact details and schedule that. Thank you.
All right, we've got a lady in the back here. You did raise your hand, right? No. Oh, okay, so Ray.
Hey, Mark. Again, yeah, your presentation was really good. One of the one of the members of our youth advisory board in Alameda County. And this really does highlight a lot of our goals and how we're trying to incorporate what we're doing and how we're like completing our goals. And I think this would be a really good presentation. If you could also come and talk to some of the youth on like one of the days you're free, that would be awesome.
Of course, more than happy to.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation, Mark. I just wanted to, there's something at the end that struck, I mean, that I think we should think about when we're housing people. We want people to be able to like see more of I guess what opportunities are out there. But when we house people, we take the community, basically an unhoused community in a sense, and we put everybody in the same building. And it's like, instead of mixing us all up so that we can see that there's more out there, that there's opportunity and stuff, we still put the hood in a brand new building and expect different results. But you didn't change the environment. And that's no disrespect to anybody, but we gotta spread people out.
Yeah, I think the way that we structured I mean, this is a much longer conversation, right? But like the way that we have structured affordable housing development is not great, right? And so it often, again, re-entrenches the redlining that we've seen. And so we don't have options, right, in terms of helping people to move into, I mean, like, you know, I've worked with families who like are really just trying to move to a place where they can get their kids into a better school, right? And it is so hard. And so I think, you know, it's one of those places where if we understand race, again, as an economic position, a lot, I think, starts to become clear about what we need to do, which is like, okay, if we want to support people and being able to access those opportunities or see those other things, then we actually need to we need to help them pay to be there, right? And there are a number, again, of different ways to do that, market side controls or personal intervention. But we need to be thinking about the money.
Last one, and then we're gonna take a break.
Thank you for the discussion, Mark. I mean, it's been such a good discussion. I really want to take a little bit of credit for inviting you to come. That was not my comment, but it kind of was. No, you know, one of the things that strikes me as a way to sort of embody this in our situation, right, is to think about the whiteness of the way our system thinks about housing, right? And the way in which this very individualistic idea that, oh yeah, the way we fix the system is everybody lives in their own apartment, and that's like the definition of what counts as housing, right? That's how we sort of define what's sufficient and what we fund. And that's actually not how people live across the world, right? And so what are the ways in which we can open up and sort of, I don't want to be like so radical as to say like, to like decolonize the way we think about what we fund in the homelessness system. But you know, there is this invisible way that people usually live, right? That is invisible to our system. And we talk about it when we look at what were people's incomes before they fell homeless? What was their actual rent obligation, right? $400, $600, $700. Like, our system doesn't fund that. And I think we also think that that's less like shared housing, right? I mean, I come from previously an agency that like funded tons of shared housing. Like, our system thinks that that's kind of less than, and so we don't use dollars in flexible ways. So I guess one thing for us locally to think about as a community is how can we unlock different ways of funding those resources, right? And realize that like, not everybody needs PSH, not everybody wants to live alone. And kind of the flip side of John's point, what are we doing to communities when we just take someone and put them alone in a unit somewhere and know that the primary reason that people often lose that housing is that they're bringing their friends and their community into that unit, which according to the lease is kind of a flaw, is a wrong thing, right? Yep. But in reality, it's because we're not funding community, we're funding sort of, you know, people in units. And so I think it's important to like name that and say, how do we create pathways to fund people in a less white way of thinking about what housing needs to be?
I think that's spot on. And I think that like it is deeply again like racialized and racist to tell people that the only way to secure a future is to give up generations of culture. It makes no sense.
So I did say that that was gonna be the last comment. I'm so sorry, we've got a hand up on the Zoom. I think we're gonna have to cut it kind of short there. So thank you again, Mark, for